Hello, you lovely ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mangus, and today I want to rant a little bit about Fire Emblem, because there is one thing that has been bothering the hell out of me lately, and I've thought a lot about it. We have not had a good Fire Emblem Jeigan archetype since Awakening. I don't know what it is about this archetype that modern Fire Emblem games just can't seem to figure out. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about it. So, in case you're living under a rock, maybe you don't know what a Jeigan is, it is an archetype in Fire Emblem. It refers to a pre-promoted unit, usually joining you at the start of the game. It is named Jeigan because the very first Jeigan was Jeigan from Fire Emblem 1. It is usually a pre-promoted unit, very strong, has better bases than the rest of your squad, but their growth rates are low, so they're meant to kind of guide you through the early game. And I think having a Jeigan, it's not just a great design, but it also is iconic. They're usually old, wise instructors there to help you get through the early game, and then kind of as your unit starts to grow into their own, they take a step back and they let the young ones take over. It's a very beautiful concept, and it really works. Almost every single Fire Emblem game in the series have featured a Jeigan character. They've always been an iconic staple of the series. And the last great Jeigan that I think we had was Frederick from Awakening. He was very strong, he was very crucial in the early game, he was an absolute must if you wanted to play on Lunatic or above. Also has one of the greatest crit quotes in the game.
Pick a god and pray.
But that's unrelated. But of course, after a while, he would start to get outpaced by your other units, and you could certainly keep him around if you wanted to, well into the mid to late game, but he kind of fell off after a while, but that's how I think a Jeigan is supposed to work. But after Awakening, strange things started happening with the Jeigan archetypes. Going into Fates, we were introduced to Gunter. He seemed like he would tick all the boxes. He's old, he's a great knight, he has decent stats, he's there during the prologue, he has even a very good personal skill which buffs your avatar. But then, after the end of Chapter 3, Gunter gets knocked through the bridge and he vanishes, and depending on what route you take, you may not even see him. He's straight up not available in Birthright, and if you pick Conquests, he doesn't join you until Chapter 15, which is so weird. Like, he's not bad at that point, but to put things into perspective, the chapter after 15, you get Sander, who has infinitely better stats than him, and Chapter 15 is the point where your units start to come into their own. Many of them might be promoted at that point. So Gunter kind of feels like an afterthought. There's not really space for him on your roster at that point. And in Revelation, it's even worse. You actually do meet him very early on in Chapter 7, but his stats are completely garbage. Now, I do know that there are things you can do with Gunter in Revelation. I know that it's a popular choice to reclass him to a Wyvern so that you get Rally Defense or whatnot, but his stats are just terrible. And you can certainly use him as a backpack or a support unit, but he can't fight. And considering how tedious Revelation's early game is, it would have been very nice to have a decent Gunter to guide you through it. Now, of course, then you have Fire Emblem Echoes, which doesn't feature a Jeigan, but that's fine, because Echoes is a remake of Gaiden, and Gaiden didn't really have a Jeigan either. Some people say that Lucas is the Jeigan. I kind of disagree with this. I don't really think he fits that mold at all. But you could argue that Echoes doesn't really need a Jeigan, because it is a lot more slower paced, it's more grindy. But then after that, we have Tree Houses. And Tree Houses is perhaps the one game in the series that needed a Jeigan more than any other game. Now, you have Byleth in that game, and Byleth is stronger than your other students, and he does have the role of, like, giving them more experience and such, but I still don't think it's fair to classify Byleth as a Jeigan. Byleth is an avatar and a main character. But there is one character which would have been perfect to have in Tree Houses as a Jeigan, and that is Geralt. He's there as a green unit in the prologue. Geralt has a great design, he's a paladin, he has a relation to the main character, he's your dad, and he even has a really good personal skill in Bladebreaker, which debuffs enemies he fight by lowering their strength and defense. This would have been incredibly useful in the early game of Tree Houses. You could have used Geralt to debuff enemies so that your students could come in and take the kill. Maddening mode was such a slog in Tree Houses. Imagine if we had Geralt in that early game, it would have been so much more enjoyable, but for some reason they just refused to let you play as him. I think it might be due to the fact that Geralt dies in the story, and maybe they didn't want to give you a character that would be later taken away from you. But I would counter and say that Geralt's death in Tree Houses would have been way more impactful if we actually got to use him as a unit. This is even more outrageous in the DLC, where the story is centered on his wife. And at that point, he's even alive in the story, and yet we never see him, which is insane. Like, he should have totally been playable in the Ashen Wolves DLC. Absolutely ludicrous how much they shafted Geralt in Tree Houses. Then we move on to Engage, and here we get a unit that initially seems very promising in Vander. Vander has decent stats, but he's not super overpowered. He's another Great Knight, so he's tanky. But the problem is, in their infinite wisdom, they decided to give Vander 15 internal levels, meaning that whenever Vander gets a kill, he's treated as 15 levels higher than he actually is, meaning he doesn't get any experience at all. By the time you reach chapter 7 or 8 of Engage, your Vander has most likely not gained a single level, and the enemies now start to outpace him. He starts getting doubled, he starts getting one-rounded, his damage output is completely bad at that point, and he just falls off. There's really no point. No matter how much you try to grind him up, he will just fall off. I know that it can be done. I've seen people max out Vander. You can do it via tedious grinding, but there's just no point, right? So here you have a unit that would have been a fantastic Jeigan if he didn't level up so slowly. If Vander just had normal experience gains, he could have gained a few levels in the early game, and maybe he would have kept up, maybe into the Soul Mark, where he would have started falling behind due to his lower growth rates. So they almost struck gold with Vander, but because of this 15 internal level crap that they gave him, he's now completely useless. And that's how easy it is to just mess up a character. So here we have a situation where ever since Awakening, they have messed up or just straight up neglected the Jeigan archetype for every single modern game. And I just have to ask, what is it that is so difficult to get about the Jeigan archetype? For me personally, I think that the gold standard of a Jeigan design is Marcus from Fire Emblem 6, The Binding Blade. In this game, he is certainly a lot stronger than the rest of your squad, but not by that much. But what I love about Marcus, especially if you play on hard mode, is that he is almost perfectly statted to deal with the enemies of the first few chapters. With an Iron Sword, he brings the axe users down to single-digit health, so that your other scrubs can come in and take the kills. And if you need him to kill someone, you can just have him use his Silver Lance. Marcus has bad growth rates, but they're not terrible, so he will get a couple of stats every time he levels up. If you're lucky, you might even get like strength and speed on him. You're not likely to, but you might get some stats, and that will help him stay relevant longer. In my experience, Marcus can stay relevant well into the Western Isles arc, maybe a little bit beyond that. And even if his stats aren't that great, you can still use him to rescue, to drop, you can use him to reach villages before bandits get there. You can even give him a few supports with your other characters because he supports a majority of the early game casts, and because he has the Ice Affinity, which is very defensive in nature, he helps them stay alive. So Marcus, to me, is a very good example of how to do a Jeigan properly. He's not overwhelmingly strong, he certainly can't solo the game like Seth can and Sacred Stones, but he is a very useful unit there to help carry you through the early game. Now, I don't know when the next Fire Emblem game is going to come out. It might be right around the corner, or maybe it's going to come out closer to spring or summer of 2025. But whatever they do, I really hope that they take a look at some of the earlier games and try to figure out how to make a decent Jeigan, because I think having a good Jeigan is so important for the replayability of a Fire Emblem game. If you have very difficult early game chapters on the higher difficulties, having a strong Jeigan to help you deal with those early chapters makes them so much more enjoyable and fun to deal with. And part of me just wonders, like, why have they messed up this time and time again? Why can't they do a Jeigan archetype justice? Have they forgotten how to design Fire Emblem games? I know that probably there's new people working on each new Fire Emblem game, and I certainly hope that by the time we get the next Fire Emblem game, that they get this one right. So yeah, this is the end of my rant. I'd like to ask you guys now, who is your favorite Jeigan in the Fire Emblem games, and why? And do you think Jeigans should be weak, like Fire Emblem 1 Jeigan, 3 Jeigan, and FE6 Marcus? Or do you like it more when the Jeigans are powerhouses like Titania and Seth that kind of help you through the entire game? What do you think the role of a Jeigan ought to be? I'd love to hear your answers in the comments section below. Thank you for listening to my TED Talk. My name is Vin Mengs. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.